Back in the 60s, it seemed like anything was possible. It was a time when the Earth shook and mighty rockets carried a few brave men to the moon. Millions watched as these space-age heroes risked their lives on the new frontier. It was dangerous stuff, and their wives knew it.
It was scary. I mean, when you stop and think the person you love is sitting on top of a rocket, doing something that few have done.
We thought, how can anybody be that brave?
The astronauts were global superstars, and their wives had to share them with the rest of the world.
They are surrounded by groupies. They are like rock stars.
And I'm not sure which husbands were unfaithful and which ones weren't, but I would say that it was a great temptation for them.
They were thrown into a lifestyle that didn't mitigate well for good marriages.
These women were behind the most famous men in the galaxy.
These were women who really were in the press eyes, in the public eye, and yet pushed to the background all the time because they didn't fly in space. But they made it so he could fly in space.
It was not what I want to do versus what he wanted to do. It was all what he wanted to do.
The Apollo space program was America's shot for the moon. It was the greatest adventure of the 20th century. And the astronauts' wives were right at the heart of it.
I experienced something that very few people ever had.
It was an incredible time. It was an incredible time. I'm so grateful that I got to be there and be a part of it.
Every few years, the first wives of the Apollo astronauts have a reunion. They've come from all over America, and this year they are getting together in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's been 40 years since the first moon landing, and these extraordinary women have agreed to tell us their story. They are the Apollo wives.
My name is Claire Whitfield, and I was married to astronaut Rusty Schweikart.
My name is Jane Dreyfus, Jane Conrad Dreyfus.
My name is Barbara Butler, Barbara Cernan Butler.
My name is Jan Evans.
My name is Martha Chaffee.
I'm Barbara Gordon.
I'm Beth Williams.
I think we're here to talk about Apollo wives, which I was many years ago, and I think I've gotten over it, finally.
Between 1967 and 1972, America spent billions on the Apollo program, an all-out effort to go to the moon.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
The heroes of Apollo were the very few men chosen to be its astronauts.
Who's that? Is that Mary Love, Mary R. Love? And this is Jean Gilbert.
But they weren't always astronauts. The men these women met and fell in love with were hotshot pilots, the very best of their generation.
He was very cute. He was a fighter pilot, and he had a certain, a little arrogance that was very attractive at that age.
When I met him, he was in the Navy. He was a Navy jet pilot. He used to say he was, 195 pounds of speed, dynamite, and deception.
They have a certain attitude. They know they're good.
They were addicted to danger. That's sort of how I would put it. But that was part of their appeal because we thought, how can anybody be that brave?
Pete Conrad was the commander of Apollo 12 and the third human being to set foot on the moon. He had just joined the Navy as a fighter pilot when he married his first wife, Jane.
At that point, I wasn't really afraid of flying because we hadn't had any deaths yet. But that began, and then I began to get more and more nervous about it. And then when he went to test pilot school, we had 10 of our friends killed in plane accidents that year. And so that really made that groove in my brain.
The wives knew their husbands were risking their lives every single day.
We had 16 pilots in that squadron, and we lost 4 of the pilots, including the executive officer and the commanding officer, and the man who was our next best man. So it was a kind of a rude introduction to the U.S. Navy for me.
We lost 7 people in the month of May, and I would have to say loss was a big part of my life for a lot of years.
One thing that was good, we never got in any fights with our husbands or tried to yell at them because we didn't know whether they were going to come home that night.
This was the era when the Cold War was being fought on the furthest frontier, and the Russians were winning. They had put Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the Earth, becoming the first man in space.
The American people are alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this. We fear this.
America decided the only way to win this space race was to be the first to put a man on the moon. That man would turn out to be Neil Armstrong. But back in 1962, he was busy flying the fastest planes on the planet. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to be an astronaut. It was a harder decision for him than it was for his wife, Janet.
Well, he eventually decided to apply for the astronaut program. That was a very difficult decision for him to make because he loved what he was doing. He finally made that decision on his own. It wasn't discussed with me, and I said, whatever you do, I'll go with you. I'll follow. There was never a thought of anything else. It was just assumed at that time that the wife went along and did what the husband wanted. It's not that way today, however. Times have changed, but I was all for whatever he wanted to do, and that was fun.
Armstrong was the first civilian to become an astronaut. The others were all military pilots, and some were fighting in America's increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there.
Ron was in Vietnam. A letter, big envelope, thick envelope, arrived in the mail addressed to Ron, and I opened it. It said, "You have the basic qualifications for astronaut training. Do you wish to volunteer? And if so, then fill out the forms and return them." I think it was within 10 days. And of course, there's no way I could even get this to Ron within 10 days. I volunteered him.
The candidates were whittled down until only the best of the best remained.
One day, Pete came home and he said, "I have to go to Washington tomorrow. This is some special assignment. I don't know exactly what it is." And so he went in to take a shower, and I was watching television, and Walter Cronkite came on, and he said, a group of young men, military men, are going to Washington to be selected to be in a manned space program. And suddenly it hit me, and so I raced into the shower, and I said, "Pete, you're going to the moon!"
He got home from Vietnam on the 26th of April. He had to report to NASA the 2nd of May. And the washing machine never stopped.
Life for the new recruits and their families was about to change forever. David Scott was one of only a handful of astronauts who would be selected for 2 Apollo missions. His first wife, Lurton, remembers when they got married.
He had a Pontiac he wanted to sell. My dad was a Pontiac dealer by that time. And so his mother brought him over to talk to my mother about helping sell his car. And the joke was always that he took me as a trade-in.
Being chosen as an astronaut meant moving to the nerve center of the manned space program in Houston, Texas.
We moved to Houston, and of course for me that was great because I grew up in Texas. It was exciting. Very quickly the wives became friends, and there were about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us lived within a block of each other.
The astronauts had come from across the United States. Now they all became next-door neighbors. For the wives, it was the beginning of friendships that would last a lifetime.
It meant that you had lots of support. It meant that you weren't alone. It meant that if you had to go someplace really quickly, there were people that would take your children and you didn't have to worry about them.
The wonderful women that I got involved with. I mean, we had such a closeness then. The men were gone. And so who else did you have to lean on?
The men immediately started a demanding training regime to prepare for their space flights. It meant they were constantly away from home and had almost no time at all for family life.
When Pete was gone all that summer before his flight, I would take the boys out. I just did everything they wanted to do. It was sailing, and we saw all the John Wayne movies and all that sort of thing because I just had to turn into a boy. What else was I going to do?
He was gone. He was just gone. And so I just ran the show. I had to keep the home fires burning. That was my job.
Most of the wives were used to having their husbands gone or flying a lot. I know when we had hurricanes, they always had to fly the airplanes out, so we had to board up the windows and get ready for the hurricane.
He would tell me he's leaving, and I'd say, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I can't tell you." I said, "When are you coming back?" And he said, "I can't tell you." And I thought, okay.
Even on the rare occasions when the men were home, their wives didn't always see them at their best.
They'd come in on Friday night and they would be flying on 100% oxygen. They'd get home about 9 o'clock, you'd have dinner ready, and that oxygen would start to wear out of their system, and they'd fall asleep, practically fall asleep eating. You can't, they're so exhausted. You can't deny them that, and they just shove them off to bed.
The wives were expected to be domestic goddesses, and they had to do it under intense public scrutiny.
It's sort of like the politicians today. They have to have religion and they have to have a nice wife, and it just looks better for people, I guess. Well, I think they kind of realized that they were going to be looked up to as heroes, so they had to have a nice image.
It was an image the wives were expected to maintain.
I know in my mind it was like, oh man, I have to be really careful and be on my best behavior and never say anything wrong. And I felt almost a burden that I had to, in a way, be guarded or be careful.
Our husband's chances of getting a flight depended on having cooperative, well-behaved wives.
In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to go into orbit around the Earth. It made him a global superstar, the likes of which the world had never seen before. More than anyone, he understood what this meant for his wife.
John and Annie had a party at their house for the new group that had come in. And I remember saying something to John about, this is such a masculine program. It's all the men. We don't have much, the women don't have much role. And he said, you're wrong, Claire. He said, I'm gonna cry. He said, I couldn't make this flight if it weren't for Annie. She is my support. And he said, you are very important, And that meant a lot to me because it was so, these guys were so tough, they were really tough guys.
But the tough times were only just beginning. The years of training and preparation had been hard, but now it was time for the real thing. This was the start of the Apollo program.
Hey, you guys, we've got some wine here. You have to pick out your glasses. You have to pay attention to what
Does it
glass
have to
you're
be a
getting.
flight you're on?
All right. Pardon me? Oh, they only have Apollo there.
Oh, okay.
So you can either take 10, but
10 or
there are
17.
two 17s there.
Oh, okay, well.
So you may have your pick.
Never before had anyone attempted a journey that was further, bolder, or more dangerous than a flight to the moon.
Riker, here's you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There were 12 Apollo missions in all. 11 of them launched successfully, but one did not. The first of the missions, Apollo 1, was very nearly the last. It was a disaster that almost brought an end to the entire American space effort. Roger Chaffee was the rookie pilot on Apollo 1, a mission his wife Martha will never forget.
The weekend before the accident, he came home and I picked him up and thought he was just going to be there for the day and would have to leave Sunday evening. And then I found out he could stay the night and didn't have to leave until Monday, which was wonderful. I mean, you know, every hour, every second you had together was well worth everything. And he left Monday, and I talked to him, I guess it was every day, but I talked to him, I can remember talking to him especially on Thursday, because Time Life usually had a dinner dance for all the astronauts, and that was to happen, I believe, on Saturday. And in talking to Roger on Thursday night, he said, I don't believe that we'll make it back. We've got all these tests that we are doing. And I said, fine, you know, I hope you make it back because I'd really like to be with you. And that's the last time I talked to him. Last time.
On the 27th of January 1967, Roger Chaffee was at Cape Canaveral with fellow astronauts Ed White and Gus Grissom. They were on the launch pad, conducting tests of the new Apollo spacecraft, which had been plagued with difficulties. Without warning, the highly volatile, pure oxygen environment inside the capsule burst into flames. The crew were trapped inside this inferno. All 3 men died. NASA quickly called the wives, not the wives of the crew who had died, but the wives who were their neighbors and friends.
So I got a call from the Cape as saying there's been an accident on the pad, go over to Martha's house. And you know, we have this tradition in the military where if something's happened to your husband, somebody will come, either his boss or, you know, the squadron commander, somebody's going to come to your house and tell you. And so they were saying, go over there and be with Martha until somebody comes.
I had to pretend until the person got there to tell her that her husband had been killed. I had to pretend there was nothing wrong, and it was so hard to do that. I know my hands were shaking and my stomach was shaking.
By the number of people that were showing up at my house, you knew. And finally, the TV was saying about an accident at the Cape, and so I had the children go in the other room. I didn't want them hearing anything like that. And then Mike Collins showed up at the door, and when I saw him, he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, I know, but I need to hear it. Sorry. And then he told me, and so I said, I've got to talk to my children. I need to tell them. And I took them back to the bedroom, and it's so hard. 5 and I think 3.5, they don't really understand. And I guess said, I don't think, Daddy's not going to be coming home. And I can't remember exactly everything that I did tell them. And of course, they didn't comprehend. He's not coming, okay, for 2 more weeks, or, they didn't really comprehend.
It was a tragedy painfully close to home for everyone in this tight-knit community.
It was a terrible time. It was a terrible time for the space program, but it was a really bad time for us. And we were with Martha every day. I mean, Gene went over there every night and took care of her books and everything because naturally, typical pilot, Roger didn't have all of his paperwork together. And I think I know Gene helped her with all that. And after that, I think it was a lesson for him because he did get all of his stuff in order.
With the death of 3 astronauts, the neighborhood was left with 3 widows.
I went over to see Pat White, whose husband had also died and whom I liked very much. And she fixed me a sandwich, and she was a zombie. But she had given me some milk to drink for lunch, and I had only drunk a little of it. So she poured my glass of milk back into her milk carton, and I thought, you know, she is totally out of it. And my heart went out to her, but I also thought to myself, I will never be like this. I'm going to build a life for myself so that if anything ever happens to Rusty, I will never be like this.
Sunday morning, they had the memorial service for Roger. And then on Monday, they had memorial service for Gus and memorial service for Ed, which I went to both of those. And it's just like a stab so many times. And Roger was buried Tuesday afternoon. Got on the plane, flew me back to Houston, and a whole new life starts.
It was a new life that Martha, a young widow with 2 children, would have to start without the help she might have expected.
Roger was there as military. He was on loan to NASA. I mean, he was still just getting his military pay. And he was on loan, so it was just the military. Then I think I got $2,000. No, NASA did nothing. They buried him. I mean, I didn't have to pay for the expenses of getting to Arlington or the funeral that I know of. Gene was handling all my stuff, but I think they did that. They did that, but there was no compensation from NASA at all.
But even in the face of her loss, Martha never stopped supporting the space program.
Roger loved what he was doing. I just wish he could have been around to see the lunar landing. He was there. He was there.
After the tragedy of Apollo 1, the entire space program was grounded until the cause of the fire could be found and fixed. It took almost 2 years before NASA was ready to risk sending men back into space. They were under enormous pressure to succeed. Back in 1961, President Kennedy had announced to the world that America would land a man on the moon by the end of the 60s.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Apollo relaunched with only 15 months of the decade remaining, so each mission would have to do more and in far less time. There was no room for error. The world watched in awe and wonder as the rockets went up in quick succession.
You have to see a flight in person to really appreciate it, because when it's on a television screen and you can put your hand up and block it, it's not so overwhelming.
The vertical assembly building, how huge it was. This huge tractor, I'm sure it was as big as this house, that moved the rocket out to the pad, and it was just mind-blowing. Then you waited and you wait and wait and wait and wait until you're just frantic, and then the thing takes off and the ground shakes, everything shakes, you shake, and you're just so tense, and it's totally amazing, you know, just incredible.
The fire's coming out, and I mean, it's so totally absorbing and consuming that it's fantastic.
Apollo 9 blasted into orbit in March 1969, but few now remember it. Rusty Schweickart was the lunar module pilot on that mission. It was his first flight into space, and his last.
His flight was really an important flight. It never gets written about or talked about or in the movies or anything because they didn't go to the moon. They went around the Earth, but it was the first flight of the lunar module. It was the first time that the lunar module actually separated and the astronauts got in. I mean, they got in it and then they separated and then they turned around and then they rendezvoused and they did all the stuff that they were going to do around the moon, but they did it in Earth orbit.
Roger, it's out there and we're turned around and proceeding with the station keeping and docking.
Rusty had gotten space sickness. He was like being airsick and he had spit up. And so they put off his spacewalk. He didn't know whether he was going to get to do it or not. And of course, he'd been training for it for years, and it was the most important thing in his whole life. Fortunately, the next day, he felt much better, and so they decided to go ahead with it. That's when he got this incredible view of the Earth.
Oh boy, what a view. It's spectacular. It really is.
He never did get another space assignment, and that was horrible. I think Rusty felt like, you know, he didn't have the right stuff.
Apollo 9 had been a vital step, testing the landing module that would attempt to land on the surface of the moon. But it quickly faded from memory, as did Apollo 10, both overshadowed by the incredible mission that followed just 4 months later.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 35 degrees, 750. Epic shadow out there. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
In July 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Among the hundreds of millions of people watching from Earth was Neil's wife, Janet.
At the time they were chosen, it was to be an attempt to land on the moon. We never knew that they were going to land on the moon until they actually did. There was never any guarantee. Everything had to work perfectly for them to get up there. It just all worked. It was amazing.
It was a stunning achievement. Kennedy's dream had become a reality. A new chapter was about to begin.
When man landed on the moon and that was successful, there was such a sigh of relief in the neighborhood that it was the beginning of a time to relax.
It came in peace for all mankind. July 1969, AD.
It was extraordinary that they had landed on the moon on the first attempt. Further missions had already been planned, and the next crew to go up was commanded by Pete Conrad. His wife Jane was there to see the liftoff.
T-minus 40 seconds and counting. The spacecraft commander now performing...
We're 6 miles from the launch pad, and we can see this white pencil against this dark sky, and we're going to watch. 3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff.
We have liftoff, 11:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
And this white thing starts to rise in the sky, and at that moment, 2 big jagged lightning bolts go right into the spacecraft.
Oh, you got your GDC. Okay, we just lost the platform, gang. I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. Roger.
There was a photograph taken of me and my family at this point, just as the lightning struck. And my face sort of looked like halfway between expectation and, fear. And my kids, their reaction was much faster because you could see that they were just horrified.
After a stormy start, Apollo 12 went on to be an almost perfect mission. And being second, they could have a lot more fun.
That may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
I would go out at night and look at the moon and say, is it really real? He cannot be up there. And then I knew intellectually he was there, but I couldn't really make it sink in.
Apollo 12 had made it all look easy.
The splashdown of Apollo 12 was almost as precise as their moon landing. The Yankee Clipper landed 3½ miles from the carrier Hornet.
But it wasn't so easy for the wives back at home. Dick Gordon was the command module pilot on the mission, and his wife Barbara found herself at the center of the world's attention.
It was a hard time, because I don't like being in the public eye. Didn't like it. Still don't care for it. When Dick flew on Apollo, they had camped right outside my bedroom window in their trailer, and I could hear them talking all night, and I was having trouble sleeping anyway.
Media interest in the Apollo program was intense. The men were in space, so in their absence, the press would descend on the homes of the wives.
We were young. We were not really prepared as far as the public attention, as far as the publicity, all that. None of us were really prepared for that.
I told the media in the very beginning, of course they're all camped out in the front yard and out in front of the garage, they could do whatever they wanted to do. I didn't care as long as it didn't interfere with my family and myself and my friends watching the TV.
Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed.
Oh, they loved that. They came in, they draped every wall in that family room with navy blue felt and set up lights and cameras and everything. I was just kind of, oh.
But some of the wives felt the press were just waiting for something to go wrong, so they would have a story.
The press out front, everybody called that the Death Watch.
They got their story when the ill-fated Apollo 13 launched in April 1970.
This is the crew of Apollo 13. Wish everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Yes, Houston, we've had a problem.
Roger, main B undervolt.
And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. We got limbs still attached. Let's make sure we don't blow the whole mission.
2 days into the mission, there was an explosion in the oxygen tank of the Apollo 13 spacecraft. The crew was stranded in space, running out of air, their lives hanging by a thread. Jan Evans was at home with neighbors and friends when news of the disaster broke.
When Apollo 13 had its problem, the phone rang, and I kid you not, it was like magic. Within 3 minutes, there was no noise, no voice, no nothing. It's just like the house was void of all men. You suddenly realized there were nothing but wives sitting around.
David immediately got up, and said, I'm going over. And I don't remember how long it was before I saw him. All the astronauts were over there working the problem. The wives, well, you just support each other.
The wives of the stricken crew faced the prospect of their husbands dying in space while the world watched. The other wives stepped in to protect their friends and face the press.
Well, people always said, why are those wives so calm and serene? And of course we weren't inside, but we sort of had to be.
All the neighbors come over and lend moral support, and always we can hear their voices, so we don't have much opportunity to really worry.
You just can't sustain that kind of a fear for any length of time. But I think we look like Stepford wives, don't you? Because we all tried to be so calm and so cool and everything, but we weren't Stepford wives.
Oh yes, I'm very optimistic too. I'm absolutely sure they're going to get back safely.
The crew of Apollo 13 did make it home safely, but only just.
Rusty and I went to greet them when they arrived, and they were so shaken. I mean, they had just survived by the skin of their teeth. And one of their crew members was Jack Swigert, and he's a great, big, tough guy, and he had tears just running down his cheeks. I mean, that really let me know what a close call they had.
Apollo 13 was a reminder of the constant danger all the men faced. Their wives learned to keep their own emotions and fears well hidden.
It was just so easy, but when you looked a little deeper into the eyes, you saw the agony or the worry or the whatever it was. It was, it was a festive occasion until you really looked inside.
Whenever we'd go out with all the press standing in your front yard, and they would say, "Oh, how did you feel about the flight today?"
So thrilled and so proud and happy to have been a part of it.
You're proud, your husband did a good job, you're thrilled that they didn't have a problem on the flight, and I'm happy. But anyway, there are just so many things you can say.
What the hell else are you going to say? I'm screaming in my pillow. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. You people are messing up my grass that I worked so hard to plant. What are you going to say?
It just became like the password. All you had to do was go out and say that.
I'm thrilled, proud, and happy. And that became the quote, and it kind of became a sarcasm in the press. And I thought, you jerks, what do you expect?
But while the wives were being proud, thrilled, and happy, their children couldn't see what all the fuss was about.
Everybody's daddy worked for the space program, which was very healthy for the children because they weren't any different than anybody else.
Russell Schweikart spent about 45 minutes outside.
They were actually much more interested in Star Trek than in the real space flights. Like, you tried to get them to come watch a launch and they would not be very interested. But call them to supper during Star Trek and you had a problem,
The children weren't always impressed by what Dad was doing in space, but sometimes it scared them.
Vicki, my eldest, she was 9, and she said that she was scared to death because Rusty had told her that the lunar module, because of weight restrictions, was made of this paper-thin material. And she had this vision of him sticking his leg through it and ruining it and dying. So she was really frightened.
It wasn't all fear in the space program. We got a lot of perks.
There were a lot of people in Houston that kind of wanted to wine and dine you, so you got invited to a lot of parties.
We were just bombarded with invitations. To me, it wasn't because but we were so great or they liked us. They just wanted a hot body there.
everybody had to have an astronaut or two at their party.
They lived kind of schizophrenic lives. They were so busy keeping the house clean, doing the laundry, taking the kids to school, and then powdering up to go to a luncheon somewhere.
We were invited to some big charity gala, and none of us had any evening gowns. So we said, well, let's just go to the secondhand store, because we didn't have any money in those days. So we all piled into a couple of cars, and we went into this thrift shop. And we found all these marvelous dresses that were designers' dresses. So we all came out with our evening gowns. So we go to the party in Fort Worth, and the fashion reporter takes us all aside and said, now I want to hear about your dresses. So they said, now what designer are you wearing? I don't know. You want to see? Look in the back of my dress. I don't know who it is.
Well, that was fun. You know, I'm kind of an outgoing person, so I enjoyed it.
Of course, everybody loved the astronauts because they'd been to the moon. So wherever you went, it was a big parade and everything. I remember they were in a parade, and I remember them saying later that night, didn't you feel like if you wanted to take over the country, you could? Because they were just, I mean, people were just mobbing them. They were so excited to see them.
The whole nation adored them, and all the astronauts ended up at America's top table.
We went to the White House for dinner. When everyone went to sit down, I sat down on the sofa, and Nixon sat down on one side and Agnew on the other. And I'm sitting there thinking, let's see, what kind of really intelligent remark can I make? I mean, you know, they don't want to know what my kids did last week.
We had dinner at the Nixon White House. We had a very small private dinner in their dining room, and he was not a very pleasant person. I was seated on his right, and I tell you, he never asked any kind of question, you know, like how many children do you have or anything.
You know, I was probably 29 years old, and it's pretty amazing. Maybe that's why it was easy, because when you're young, you adapt to things.
It wasn't just at home that the astronauts became instant heroes. From the moment they splashed down, the whole world wanted a piece of them.
After the flights, all different astronauts made wonderful round-the-world trips, met all the heads of states. We were taking them presents of moon rocks, and we presented them to kings and queens and emperors and emirs around the world.
We went around the world and around the equator in 28 days. We slept in 23 different beds. So, I mean, it was work, you know.
The fellas, it was rough. There were days they had 7 and 8 speeches a day. They were like babbling idiots. You know, couldn't even remember what they had said, if they'd already said it, you know, 20 minutes ago or not, or what.
Rusty and I went to the town that his grandparents immigrated from, which was in Alsace. And there were just tons of Schweikerts there. I mean, lots of them. And they did all the things. The little children come up and give you flowers.
They just wanted to come up, and they would just kind of touch him and say, "Hi, Ron," and everything. I think they wanted to actually touch something that had been in space.
Though everyone seemed to love the astronauts, the American public was bored with the moon. In December 1972, Apollo 17 became the first mission to launch at night, but it was also the last.
You could literally see all that ice that was actually on it, that thin sheet of ice. It was just awesome. I get chills thinking about it.
On ignition, the giant Saturn V rocket lit up the night sky like a sun.
Oh, when that thing went,
Cape for the liftoff, and it was so beautiful. And we were near a lake, and when the rocket lifted off, it was like a little past midnight.
The vibration and the rumbling, and it woke up all the fish. They were just thrashing and leaping out of the water. It was hard, not because you had never seen such a sight as that before.
It's just absolutely beautiful, but to think that the vibration of the earth from that sound of the rocket, it was amazing.
Hey, John, this is perfect with the loom and the rover and you and the old flag.
The launch may have been spectacular, but American taxpayers were grumbling about the mounting cost of the Apollo program. It had been just 2.5 years since the first moon landing, but the public had lost interest. It was all over. Apollo 17 was the last mission to the moon. No one has been back since.
Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. I was strolling on the moon one day.
Barbara's husband stepped off the moon and into history.
He was the last man on the moon. His footprints there, the last one there. He has that title of being the last man on the moon, so that until somebody else is there, he'll always have that.
2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston.
Since Apollo, no manned missions into space have ever gone further than a few hundred miles into Earth orbit. In their epic journeys to the moon, the Apollo astronauts had traveled more than 250,000 miles from the Earth. They are the only human beings who have ever seen the Earth from deep space.
To be on the dark side of the moon, he said, that is eerie. There's no way to describe black. There's no moonshine, earthshine, no stars. I mean, it's a total black void. And then you come and you have Earthrise.
Just being in space, he said, you look around and you just think, it's so perfect. It couldn't have been created by accident.
To see the whites of the clouds and the blues of the oceans and the browns and rusts of the continents, and to watch the Earth rotate. Lucky man, fortunate man.
I think it changes them.
One of the men, I got really religious. I don't think Pete seemed one bit different when he came back. I guess he always thought he was a hero from the time he was born.
The moon had an incredibly powerful pull on the lives of the astronauts and their families. But the monumental effort took a heavy toll on many of their marriages.
After they'd all finished their flights, they were still celebrities, and they had a lot of groupies, especially at the Cape.
Even if our husbands had two heads, when they're down at the Cape, they are surrounded by groupies. They are like rock stars.
And I think they were all susceptible to the flattery that they get. And I'm not sure which husbands were unfaithful and which ones weren't, but I would say that it was a great temptation for them.
The odds were, not in our favor.
Don Isley was the command module pilot on Apollo 7, but he's better remembered as the first of the astronauts to get divorced.
I knew something was going on, and Don wouldn't acknowledge it, and I even said to him, I don't know what it is, I know something's wrong, I just don't want to be sitting here with all this publicity of the flight and then I have a divorce a month later.
Don had become involved with another woman while spending his time in Florida preparing for his flight. At first it was kept a secret, but in the glare of the world's media, the news got out that his marriage was on the rocks.
Nobody had had a divorce in the program. And what these guys did when they were gone, we didn't know. So it was a shock to all of us.
Then the rumors started And oh my God, my phone would ring. Like, I had people, Paris Match, knocking on my front door. The phone would not stop. It's pretty humiliating to have a divorce and announced in every newspaper and every television program and every magazine, and pretty humiliating.
The divorce was announced officially soon after Apollo 7 returned to Earth.
We were outraged at this because I don't think divorces were quite as common back then as they are today. And we were absolutely outraged.
I was furious at her husband because she had a very sick baby who was dying.
I was probably already a wreck because Matt got leukemia. So he was ill for 18 months, and he died 6 months before the flight.
He was off with his girlfriend, and he wasn't helping her. He wasn't going to the hospital with her. He wasn't helping her at all.
A couple of times the doctor said, well, I think we need to call Don. We're not sure if Matt's going to make it through tonight. And I'd say, oh, I don't want to bother him now. But that wasn't it. I knew I couldn't find him, and I thought, I'll deal with that after I deal with this.
Apollo 9. We had fun.
Well, they all were fun.
Harriet had gone through the first divorce of the space program. But it wasn't to be the last. Of the 10 women here, 7 are divorced.
I was in big time denial. You know, somebody else might be screwing around, but of course my husband isn't. And I think a lot of us are that way. Well, this is the divorce song again.
Okay. You have to stand up to do this.
And here we all are. I can't believe it, that every single one of us is either divorced or their husbands are deceased or both.
When the wives that got divorced went through their divorce, I always tried to be supportive. But it wasn't until I went through my divorce that I realized how really painful it was.
Oh, I like that one.
When Claire's marriage broke up, she found a unique form of therapy to help her through. She turned to her ukulele.
I won't be here to interrupt you. I won't be here to contradict you. I won't be here to steal your thunder. You can be macho man on your own. No, you can be macho man in your airplane. You can be macho man on your computer. You can be macho man in your sports car. You can be macho man on your own.
We had a nice divorce, if that's possible. I mean, no divorce, but I remember our friends always saying, well, if we ever get a divorce, we want it to be like yours and Jean's, because we're good friends, because we'll always love each other.
I won't be here to cook your dinner. I won't be here to wash the dishes. I won't be here to do your laundry. You can be spotless man on your own. No, you can be spotless man in the kitchen. You can be spotless man in the bathroom. You can be spotless man in the bedroom. You can be spotless man on your own.
Life goes on. You move forward. You don't think about the past.
I won't be here to have opinions. I won't be here to say what I think. I won't be here to keep my mouth closed. You can be right on your own. No, you can be right about the children. You can be right about the money. You can be right about the universe. You can be right on your own. No, you can be macho man in your airplane. You can be spotless man in the bathroom. You can be right about the universe. You can be macho man on your own.
She can't get up now. I knew her when she could.
In the heady days of the Apollo program, the astronauts' wives were surrounded by the press and photographed time and time again. But in the 4 decades since, the women have slipped from the limelight. To mark this reunion, photographer Kathy Opie is taking one last picture of the women together before they go their separate ways.
What did your kids think about their dads in terms of what they were doing?
Everybody
Different?
Everybody that lived down there, throughout the whole area, somehow or their dad was involved with the space program.
But none of your kids married one another or any of that?
That would have been wonderful.
I actually really imagine them kind of scattered like rocks to a certain extent within the landscape. Well, just out of curiosity, who has a moon rock?
No one. Oh, nobody.
No one. Nobody has a moon rock.
But I'll be happy to sell you one. I got a yard full of them.
At a really good price.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
They seem like they have a great rapport with one another in terms of their friendships. I think they're a pretty amazing group of women. Is everybody comfortable?
Though these women lived through the most incredible events of the 20th century, it took years before they themselves realized what they had shared.
20 years went by before we had a chance to regroup and find our memories together and all the things that we had shared together. But it wasn't until, I think it was 1992, that we had our first gathering together.
That weekend was absolutely fabulous. Everybody unburdened that they'd never said before. All these things that came pouring out of them.
It was wonderful seeing everybody and getting together again.
And we talked and talked and talked.
Talk.
It was fabulous. And that way we got very close.
Any hierarchies here? Is there hierarchy?
Apollo may have been responsible for many of their marriages falling apart, but it is the very thing that now brings these women together.
It's really nice to be with people that you can be so free and talk about a subject that very few people can really understand.
Do you want to play somebody right there?
Well, we all have in common that we lived through this amazing time together where, I mean, it's like people who've been shipwrecked together or, you know, you have this in common.
After years of supporting their astronaut husbands, the Apollo wives are now looking out for one another.
Okay. Is everybody comfortable? Everybody doing good?
I mean, these were women who really were in the public eye and yet pushed to the background all the time. I just never think they've gotten the credit they deserved, because I think the whole thing ran smooth, mostly because of them.
And just turn your head a little bit like this, right there. And now come back to me, right there, like that.